The White Album was not made by the Beatles. Now I know some of you probably read the title of this video and thought this was going to be some of those weird and ridiculous conspiracy theories and were ready to go crazy in the comments section. But before you do that, let me explain myself for a minute. I am by no means subscribing to any of these weird and crazy theories like the one that says that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by a clone, or there's another one that says that the Beatles were hypnotized in India and were replaced by 4 doppelgangers and those were the ones who wrote the White Album. We're not going to do that today. I don't believe it, and I actually think it's kind of silly. You know, everything I'll say in this video is going to be a personal interpretation based on the nature and the sound of the recording sessions of this album and what was happening behind the scenes too, because there were a lot of weird things going on, you know. Now, to explain why I believe the White Album is not actually a Beatles album, we have to understand the background, because 1967 was by far the most successful year for the Beatles. They did not only release 2 amazing albums praised by the critics, but they actually sold millions. The Sgt. Pepper sessions were not only incredibly productive, but they also showed the most collaborative moments by the band, creating some of the most groundbreaking music of the 60s. You know, actually a lot of people see this album as the peak of the Beatles as a band, and actually they're kind of right. Because whether you like this album or not, where you think it's the best Beatles album, or if there's other albums like Abbey Road, Revolver, and Rubber Soul that are better than this one, you have to admit that we never saw the band working together as much as we did in this album. In previous records, it seemed like everyone was bringing a song to the table that was pretty much finished and then everyone else worked around it. Instead, in this record, it was completely different. Every band member was constantly involved with the songwriting, with the instrumentation, and yes, you know, of course you had a leading member deciding how he wanted the song to sound like, but that doesn't really take away from the fact that the other band members were also very heavily involved in every step of the way. Because of all the fame and all the praise the Beatles were getting after the release Sgt. Pepper's, the band was kind of overwhelmed. People don't really understand how much different being a celebrity was in the 60s compared to 2024. Right now there's phones, right now there's, you know, cameras everywhere, so paparazzis don't really have a hard time reaching an artist. It's actually kind of simple. If you want to know where Kanye is right now, this exact moment, you just have to go on Instagram or go on Twitter, and if he's out in the street, someone's gonna know where he is. The same thing with Paul, the same thing with every celebrity in the world. In the 60s, it was very different. There were no phones, you know, no cell phones, cameras were harder to carry around, so everything was based on rumors, sightings. Oh, Paul was seen in this time in London at this exact location. We have to go there next morning to see if he's still gonna be there. Because again, you guys don't really understand. Me neither. I'm 23 years old, but when you read the stories, if something like, I don't know, a Paul McCartney lookalike went out to the bakery to get some bread and he kissed a woman on the cheek, articles were made about Paul McCartney cheating on his wife. You know, that's how it was. They wanted to get away from everything, you know, connect with their inner selves and remember why they started doing music in the first place, which is why in 1968 they decided to enlist in a transcendental meditation course in India, and for the most part the trip was very effective. The band was seemingly obsessed with the idea of experimenting more and doing more things with music, things that no one has ever done before, that they kind of forgot how much more music there was to be created, which is the guitar and their voices, which is exactly what they had throughout this whole trip. They only had a guitar and their imagination, and somehow that sparked the greatest creative outburst the Beatles ever had. McCartney wrote songs that went from acoustic, beautiful pieces like I Will, Mother Nature's Son, and Blackbird to chaotic, genre-bending stuff with Helter Skelter, What Are We Doing on the Road, and Back in the USSR. As well as some of the songs from his very first solo release, McCartney 1. I believe that Teddy Boy and Junk are the only ones that are confirmed to have been written in this writing sessions, but songs like Mammy Was Lonely and Maybe I'm Amazed are also theorized to originate from these writing sessions too. John had the opportunity to write songs about some of the stories that happened throughout the trip, like Dear Prudence and the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, Sexy Sadie, the most controversial one, being based on rumors made against the Maharishi. But because he was in relative isolation, he also had the opportunity to look deep within himself and write songs about very personal stuff, like the beautiful and hauntingly emotional Julia, where he writes about his trauma with his mom, and then you have I'm So Tired, where he reflects on his life and how it's burning him out. It was actually around this time that he came up with a lot of the ideas that ended up on his first 2 solo releases, Plastic Ono Band and Imagine. I'm not saying that he wrote the songs that are featured on these albums, but the ideas, the melodies, the lyrics, some of them were conceived around the time John was in India. George, after playing around for 2 years experimenting with the sitar, creating songs like Norwegian Wood, Blue Way J, he decided to go back to guitar as his main songwriting partner, and thank God he did, because it was around this time that he made songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Long Long Long, and some of the songs that were featured on All Things Must Pass. He wrote quite a few songs, and the fact that a lot of these songs didn't make it on the White Album, Let It Be, or Abbey Road is the main reason why, George ended up having a big problem with the band, but we'll get to that in a minute. And Ringo, Ringo, he didn't like the food. He spent only 10 days in India, I believe, and then he came back to London. So there's not a lot of things to say about him. Plus, Ringo's not really a songwriter, or wasn't back then. So there's not a lot to say about Ringo. I don't want to be mean, honestly. I love Ringo. I love the fact that he adapted to every single change the band went through. But when it comes to this trip and this whole video, actually, there's not a lot to say. So in other words, we have about 20 tracks on the White Album being written around this time, and also some of the songs that were going to be featured on the first solo releases after the band broke up. So it's safe to say this is a very productive trip. Once they got back and they started working on the White Album, things were a little off. Ever since the Revolver sessions, there were a few issues. The Beatles were a band that was not performing live anymore, and that slowly but surely was taking away the thing that got them together in the first place. The Sgt. Pepper sessions, even though they were the best collaborative moment by the band, they were also the final nail in the coffin, because a lot of the band members, especially George Harrison, were feeling left out of a few projects, being treated as only a guitarist when he was actually a fantastic songwriter. There was so much in studio experimentation that a lot of times they were not even playing together. They had to be separated because they needed the guitar to sound a certain way and then the drums to sound a certain way, and they couldn't reach that sound by playing all together in one room. And that meant even more when some of the tracks from the White Album, actually most of them, were conceived in complete isolation. That made the creative gap even bigger. Every band member was pushing in a different direction, so when they got together to actually make the album, it was clear that something was off. The chemistry wasn't really there. We cannot ignore that the fact that Yoko was there was also a problem. I'm not a Yoko hater, I didn't really like her music, but I don't really support any of these racist comments you see on the internet towards her just because she was there. But it was clear that her being there doing absolutely nothing, and when she was actually doing something, she was just screaming into the microphone in the most annoying way possible, threw the rest of the band members off, especially Paul and George. Actually, George was so fed up with her that during the first years after the Beatles broke up, he quoted that Yoko was one of the main reasons why the band broke up. She was just that annoying, apparently. One of the most important components of the songwriting ethic was the Lennon-McCartney duo and their communication, So John had an idea, showed it to McCartney. McCartney gave some ideas for the track, and then boom, a great track was born. The same thing could happen with McCartney. He had an idea, showed it to John, he modified a few things, a great track is born. And now that communication was broken because of Yoko Ono. She actually gave some terrible input and made great songs like The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill really annoying, with some terrible vocals that are just unexplainable, how someone can listen to that and say, yeah, this is good, we should release this. George started to make incredible pieces of music that were on par with a lot of the songs that Lennon and McCartney were doing at the time, but he only has 4 songs in a 30-track album. This obviously didn't sit that well with him, because it was around this time that he started being really confrontational to any idea that John or Paul had for his songs. It was actually around this time that George Harrison started to contemplate the idea of leaving the Beatles and, doing his own things. He was working on the Wonderwall project too, so that was a big thing for him. There was just a lot of things that were telling George, maybe I should leave the Beatles. George was also very open about how awkward Yoko made him feel, and John felt attacked. There's also heroin addiction problems that he was facing at the time. There's the fact that Paul McCartney was constantly criticizing his avant-garde tendencies. The fact that he was doing albums with Yoko behind the scenes was also a problem for the band. There was just a lot of things happening that made the recording sessions for this album a total chaos. Like, this album was not supposed to be the masterpiece that it was. Ringo was so fed up by the nature of the recording sessions being so hostile and awkward that he decided to leave the group for a brief period of time, and that is the reason why in tracks like Back in the USSR, Paul McCartney is the one playing the drums. The band simply didn't stop without him. And talking about Paul, he was also very annoyed by the constant comments made toward his most traditional pieces like Honey Pie and Martha My Dear, especially the ones made by John Lennon, because he was very critical about this side of Paul, and that simply annoyed him. Basically, the band was in shambles. They didn't want it to be a band anymore. They were about to break up, so how do you complete an album when there's so many if, buts, and maybes? Well, basically, you just let everyone do their own thing, basically, and so they did. Which is the reason why I personally believe that the White Album is an album made by Paul, John, George, and Ringo, not by the Beatles. And I know that it's a silly way to see things, I know it's a technicality, but honestly, when you listen to albums like Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatlemania records, or even Abbey Road, which was an album that came after this one, can you really tell me it feels the same? In those records, you feel the entire band in every single one of the songs, aside from some acoustic pieces, but for the most part, you feel like every band member is involved in the songwriting, the instrumentation, even sometimes the production. You can feel the energy of the Beatles. In this album, can you tell me it's the same way? I personally think there's no way. This is a unique album in the Beatles' discography, an album where 4 individual geniuses were releasing songs under the name of the Beatles, and maybe that's the reason why I love it so much. I don't know if I've said it in this video, but for me, the White Album is the greatest piece of music ever made. I've said it multiple times in multiple videos. I have a ranked video of the Beatles' discography in my channel, and this album is the undisputable #1. I knew from the moment I started making that video that the White Album was going to be #1 because there's simply not another record that makes me feel so many different emotions and entertains me in so many different ways. This album is truly special, and I believe that the reason why it's special is because we're seeing the peak potential of every single Beatles separated by the lack of chemistry they had. John Lennon actually said that you can hear the Beatles breaking up in this album, and I totally understand what he meant, because even though you're not really listening to a Beatles album, you're listening to a compilation of songs made by the band members of what it used to be the greatest band of all time, it remains as the best piece of music ever made. Or actually, I believe no one can say it better than Paul himself, so yeah.
I'm not a great one for that. Maybe it was too many of that. Look, what do you mean? It was great. It sold. It's the bloody Beatles White Album. Shut up.
However, that is only my personal opinion, so if you have your own, and I'm pretty sure you do, you can go ahead and leave it down below in the comments, and I'll make sure to read it and give you my opinion on your opinion. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you guys want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, album, or artist, you can leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to fulfill your requests as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.